Thank you for being here on this Sunday evening. I'm Jane Woodward, and I have something important to say. We are all in for a very big treat. I'm very honored to stand in front of you and welcome Duncan Robinson. He's an advisor to the foundation that supports the Foster. He's an advisor and a friend to the artist that makes this facility possible, Tony Foster. And we're going to hear a lot about his journey with Tony. Duncan's known Tony for almost 4 decades. He's going to tell you more about that. And it was my idea to create this lecture series about a year ago. I think this is the 11th or 12th lecture. And Duncan occupies a very important place in this lecture series because of all the people that will have spoken about Tony. Duncan has known Tony the longest. And so his perspective is very, very valuable in that context. I want to tell you a little bit about Duncan. Duncan has had an illustrious career as an art historian on both sides of the pond, though it all began in England where he was born. Duncan was educated at Clare College at Cambridge University, then attended Yale as a Mellon Fellow for his master's in art history in 1965, returning to Cambridge in 1967, where he furthered his art history research and later was appointed to a position overseeing the paintings and drawings at the Fitzwilliam Museum. Duncan became director of the Yale Center for British Art, a public art museum and research institute that houses the largest collection of British art outside of the United Kingdom in 1981. He held that position for 14 years, leaving to become the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge. Duncan has deep and strong ties to Cambridge, as he was also master and then honorary fellow of Magdalene College and deputy vice chancellor of the university. A recognized author, former chair of the Henry Moore Foundation, vice chair of the Arts Council of Britain, as well as serving as trustee of a number of organizations, including the Royal Collection, Duncan was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth 10 years ago for services to the heritage of art. And notably, for Tony Foster, Duncan has recently collaborated with the Yale Center for British Art and its current director, Elizabeth Fairman, who we have the great privilege of, she is joining us here today. And the two of them are working together with Kristen Poole, our artistic director, to facilitate the acquisition by the Yale Center for British Art of a mini journey of Tony's work entitled Heraclitus III, 7 Days on the Colorado. We asked Tony why he named the six-piece work on the Grand Canyon that is going to be acquired by Yale. Why does it have this name? And he said that Heraclitus said, "No person ever steps in the same river twice," meaning, of course, that time moves on, the river changes, and we change. As it is the 3rd time I have now rafted and painted the Colorado, it seems appropriate. So that's the explanation for the work that Yale will be acquiring. This artwork and other Foster paintings will be on exhibition at the Yale Center for British Art in the late May of 2019 through most of August of 2019. And we'll be sharing specific information about this exhibition in our newsletter and on display here as the details get a little teeny bit more firmed up. But for those of you that spend time on the East Coast, it will be a wonderful opportunity to see Tony's art on display outside of the Foster. It's really a magical moment and a great circle, as Duncan's going to share with you, given Tony's long history with Duncan, that this opportunity, this acquisition at Yale, and the opportunity to see an exhibition of Tony's work back at the Yale Center for British Art this spring and early summer. It's going to be it kind of gives me, personally, given how long I've known Tony, it gives me some goosebumps. It's very, very exciting. So, without further ado, I would like to ask you to join me in giving Duncan Robinson a very warm welcome to the Foster.
Jane, how can I possibly live up to that introduction?
You just give me a hug. Thank you so much, Duncan.
Well, thank you, and thank all of you for coming here this evening. I'm very pleased that Jane switched the emphasis there from me to Tony, because this evening is all about Tony. But let me preface everything that I'm going to say with thanks not just to you, but on your behalf to Jane, because really, without her faith in Tony's work, from the moment that she first saw it in Washington, quite a number of years ago now, for the opening of the High Sierra exhibit there, she has supported Tony in more ways than I think most people realize. The Foster here is, in a way, not just a direct reflection, but a culmination of that confidence that she's had in Tony. Without Jane and her support, Tony would not stand anywhere near to the position he now holds in the world as one of the great watercolorists, as one of the great artist explorers of the 20th and 21st century. So Jane, we owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. This is a wonderful evidence of all of that. I'm also going to start with a question, because I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm following on in a very distinguished succession of speakers, many of whom have had what can only be described as real journeys with Tony. I may have known him longer than most people, but I am also a passive observer of Tony and his journeys. As I shall point out right at the end, the longest journey I've made with Tony is to Cornwall. But I would like to ask a question. How many of you heard Jim Ballinger speak about Tony and the Grand Canyon? How many of you have been to other talks in the series here? Because there's bound to be a little bit of repetition, not only because it's Tony, but because I think many of us who admire his work in the way we do, after all, see certain similarities, and dare I say it, some of us even think alike. But as Jane explained, my first contact with Tony was just about 40 years ago, and it wasn't anything to do with his own work or career as a painter, because at the time he was a painter, yes, but he was spending a great deal of his time as the visual arts officer for the southwest of England, a responsibility where he cared for other artists and put his own work on the back burner while he carried out very, very effectively, I have to say, the extraordinary responsibilities of being a regional arts officer, involved in promoting the work of other people, of helping to organize exhibitions. And it says a lot for that innate modesty of Tony's, that he was prepared to sacrifice his own career in the short term for the benefit of fellow artists in the region where at that point he was living and working. So that was our first contact. We sat on committees together. We were involved in my part as a museum curator, his as a regional arts officer. And I suppose after I left England, as I thought permanently in 1981, and moved to Yale, inevitably we sort of lost touch. Then in 1984, I heard from Tony. I received a telephone message to say that he was in New England and would very much like to drop in to see me, what I assumed would be a social call. And those of you who heard Jim Ballinger's talk, if you didn't, by the way, you can still see it as well as listening to it on the Foundation's website, on the Foster website. In a way, my experience was very similar to Jim's, because in this case, I knew Tony. I met him, as I've explained, and under the circumstances, but I was getting what I thought was just a social call from an old friend. And when he came into my office at the Yale Center for British Art, there we go. Oh, that is just a kind of, sorry, this is rather a homemade slide. I just pulled out of off the bookshelves all of the cards and invitations and one or two of the catalogues that over the years have come my way. You needn't spend long on the slide because you can see all of this material in the showcases in the entrance to the building. But there we are, New Haven, Connecticut, the Yale Center for British Art, the rather uncompromising modern building on the left there, within the very kind of instant ivy context of Yale's architecture. It was to this building that Tony came in 1984, bringing with him what to me looked like a length of plastic drain pipe, which he then unrolled in my office, which wasn't this rather grand room, the founder's room. I owe this slide to Elizabeth, by the way. She sent me the image just a few weeks ago. In my day, it was a slightly more austere Louis Kahn interior space. It's since been aggrandized into the founder's room. But right next door to my office, we spread out on the table the contents of Tony's plastic tube. In those days, it was a plastic tube. It wasn't that tropical version made out of aluminum or metal or something that is on display outside in the hallway. And out of it came the extraordinary works that he just produced on his very first trip in this country, his second ever travel journey as a journeying artist. This is a watercolor, as you can see, and the first impression I had was frankly overwhelming. I have seen work like this by a contemporary artist that I could think of. Here was somebody who had mastered one of the most difficult of all visual media, the use of watercolor on paper. And he'd mastered it as an itinerant artist, somebody working on the hoof, somebody working out of doors. But one of the things that always strikes you about watercolor, and forgive me, I'm probably repeating or saying things that are very familiar, one of the things that always strikes you about watercolor is that watercolor operates through transparent washes that are applied to a light ground. The paper often gives you the light in a watercolor. It's the opposite of most oil painting, where you're looking at something which goes from dark to light as the colors are applied to the canvas or the panel, and you end up in an oil painting putting the highlights on last. With watercolor, you can retain the white of the paper as the element that brings light into the composition. It's a very obvious point when you make it, but the texture of the paper is equally important. Drawing a brush across the paper, if it's good watercolor paper of the kind that Tony uses, you can leave the paper, you can draw a relatively dry brush across the surface and leave the hollows in the paper unpainted, so that again can contribute to the light. And then finally, you can do what so many 19th century watercolorists did, a technique that became forgotten in the 20th century. You can actually scratch out using the other end of your brush to again give lights and highlights to the composition. So here was an artist who had really not reinvented, but rediscovered, remastered, if you look, and mastered for himself the techniques of this traditional English form of English painting, watercolor on paper. When you think about it, of course, for the traveling artist, watercolor has certain advantages. It's portable. You can roll your papers up in a tube and put them on your back. You can carry relatively small boxes of paint. Most places, not all the places Tony's worked, but in most places you can get hold of water and you can moisten and soften your pigments and apply them with fine brushes. All well and good. The other problem with watercolor is it's fugitive and it's vulnerable. What happens if you're working out of doors and it starts raining? Worse still, what happens if you're trying to paint in a blizzard? Paper and paint can both dissolve, and you can waste hours of effort because you're dealing with this highly fragile and friable medium. So, all in all, there's both an opportunity and a challenge. And what amazes me about Tony and his work is the extent to which he's taken those opportunities, but also never shrunk from the challenge, working on an increasingly large and ambitious scale in front of the motive, taking work out there into, in some cases, the most inhospitable of natural environments, and bringing back the raw materials, which are then finished in the studio, into these wonderful works. But this was my first sight, my revelation, if you like, of just how impressive Tony's work was at this very early stage in this early journey through New England. Of course, he was the first to say that he owed an awful lot to the people who accompanied him. Here he is with Parker Huber, probably, I suspect, at the summit of Mount Katahdin, the highest mountain in Maine, on this watercolor journey that he'd made through New England, along the Connecticut River, through New Hampshire and Maine. As Jane knows, because she has accompanied Tony on the journeys, as you know already from what you've seen and heard from other people and what you can see here in the Foster, Tony is, in his own words, heavily reliant on the people who support him in his journeys. And Parker Huber is simply the first of a long and very distinguished succession of people who have journeyed and traveled with him. And of course, he returns from those journeys, not just with finished watercolors and watercolors in progress, which he'll continue to work on when he gets them back into his studio in Cornwall, but also, if you like, with the other raw materials of the trips. And this is, as you can see, a page torn out of one of his albums, where there are sketches, drawings, including drawings which fix. There is the outline of the summit of Katahdin on the top right, but also the little trophies, the packets of seeds, the things that he's collected along the way, all carefully preserved, labeled, added, and ultimately, of course, authenticating the journey that he's undertaking. They're the visual evidence of his presence in the landscape, and they continue to live because they get added to the works when he's finally finished with them. And even the photographs, one you've just seen of the two of them on the summit, but also one there of the lonely artist in the mist, a very kind of telling image of the traveling artist and the natural hazards which can befall him, as this obviously did not a painting day, the 30th of August 1984. But of course, all of this is preparatory to the finished work, which, such as this, and again you can see the original of this just round the corner, so then you will understand just how amateur this slide is and how badly the colors reproduce in it. But I've mentioned the authentication of the journeys, which to me is a terribly important part of Tony's work. And here you see, apart from that, again, wonderful watercolor image of the mountain across the stretch of water, reminding us of Tony's control of the elements, whether he's painting the sky, the sea, earth, fire, ice, water. He's a master of the elements of nature. But he continues to document his journey with these marginalia. They're like the marginalia in a medieval manuscript. Those monks loved putting in those wicked little figures, sometimes to undermine the message of the text. Here, it's reinforcement. And for those of you who know New England, as I do as a New Englander by adoption, you'll recognize the flora and the fauna that are precise to the places themselves. The raptors, the ospreys and the eagles, equally the herons, the blue herons, which for anyone who tries to stock a fish pond in Vermont are an absolute menace because they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. And of course the famous moose, which again can be a bit of a menace, particularly if it goes on a rampage in a car park. And that's been known to happen too. Tony, of course, records all of this in words as well as images. And I suppose one of the advantages of being an armchair traveler is you read a lot. And so I've made a point of following Tony through the images, which are the end product of those journeys, but equally through the texts that he writes. And so on the 5th of July, just a few weeks before the Mount Katahdin finished work, paddled upstream and found a nice silver maple, the one we were just looking at. The only position to paint it from was in the canoe, so hammered some poles into the riverbed, tied the canoe to them and set to work. Highly complex tree, kept me working all day until 5:30. 2 youths went past in a canoe. The first of them shouted out, "What you doing? Just relaxing?" Me, "No, painting." "Well, good luck." And then the second youth in the canoe, "He don't need luck, he's got talent." Which Tony said would have been a compliment if they'd actually seen what he was doing. Equally, the moose, just a few days later, saw a third moose and decided to have a shot. Not, of course, with a weapon, but with a brush, at painting it. We grounded the canoe. I stood ankle deep in the swamp doing a small painting. The beast began to wander off before I'd finished. So in order to see her face and head, I made loud farting noises to attract her attention. The results were surprising. She started to come towards me with a determined tread and got quite close before deciding she'd rather graze instead. She didn't actually leave until I stopped making moose calls. So, in words and images, these extraordinary journeys and drawings. Needless to say, by the time Tony left my office that day, I'd more or less committed to the next stage of our collaboration together, because he was working towards an exhibition, Thoreau's Country, a Visual Diary, by, of course, Tony Foster. He'd already lined up a showing in Britain at the Royal Watercolour Society, and he was also looking to exhibit here in this country, in the United States. And I'm very proud to say that it was the Yale Center that initiated the tour, the American tour of Thoreau's Country in the following year, in 1985. Thoreau also, I think for me, as well as for Tony, there was a resonance here, or at least it was one I recognized straight away, partly because of the Yale Center itself, which was founded by someone who was deeply steeped in English literature, who always thought of English art, the painting, whether it's in oils or watercolors, as very much associated with and connected to the whole history of English literature and the literary traditions of the British Isles. And so to have an artist whose work at this stage was inspired by literature resonated with the Yale Center for British Art and its, if you like, its interdisciplinary phase, because it does have one of the great collections of books and illustrated books, as my former colleague Elizabeth Fairman can explain far more clearly than I can. So there was a synergy here between the centre and its focus on British art and literature, and an artist who, in the 20th century, late 20th century, was embracing both of those and the connections between them. And Thoreau, of course, famous as one of the 19th century's early environmentalists, a man who famously wrote that I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front the essential facts of life, and then added, I think, rather more down to earth and perhaps more prosaically, but equally truthfully, the two best organs for interpreting the landscape are the soles of the feet. So, Thoreau's Country, a visual diary, opened at the centre the following May. That's a shot which I'm ashamed to say the centre doesn't seem to have any archival photographs this far back in its relatively recent history. But this was a shot which Tony had either taken or perhaps the centre had supplied, because it's clearly a black and white photograph. You see his works. On the whole, they were fairly small scale, watercolours arranged there in a suite of second floor galleries. And there you have Tony and Anne standing outside the centre on the 6th of May at the opening of the exhibition. But the other reason I'm showing you this image is because you can see he shared a double billing, Thoreau's Country, a visual diary by Tony Foster, and you can probably just make out below it the Art of Paul Sandby. And for me, this was actually, it was coincidental, but it was a very fortunate coincidence, because Paul Sandby, after all, is not only a great mid-18th century English watercolour painter, he was also a plein airist. He was one of the first English artists in the second quarter of the 18th century, from the 20s, 30s, 40s of the 18th century onwards, to work out of doors and to paint as an observer of the landscape, as opposed to producing idealized images based on compositional formulae inherited from the classical tradition of the 17th century. So Sandby, very much, I think, helping to establish that tradition in English watercolour painting to which Tony himself belongs. These are all images taken from the centre's collection. So again, you can see how appropriate it is that he should take his place in this succession, in this chain of this tradition of great painting. John Robert Cousins, a late 18th century artist, the next generation or so, even two, beyond Sandby, who travelled twice to Italy as a watercolour painter, working for Grand Tourists. But an artist for whom the journey, the way to Italy, was just as fascinating as the destination. He was clearly overwhelmed by the experience of the Swiss Alps. This is Chamonix, the Needles, or the Aiguille de Chamonix, which he witnessed because there was no other way to get to Italy unless you went entirely by sea docked or landed at Livorno or some other Italian port. The overland route took you through the Alps. But you can see for Cousins this was not a disadvantage. It was an opportunity that he seized as an explorer artist, as a traveller, to take the time to produce these watercolours, again in this very traditional medium where the light is all provided by the white of the paper. And the very fact that this is monochromatic, it's true the blues may have faded a bit from the sky, which is one of the great dangers with watercolour, of course, over time, but where, once again, a master of the medium of watercolour has found a way to convey the awe-inspiring scale, the grandeur of this landscape. The word sublime, which was so popular in the late 18th century, comes immediately to mind and to the lips as we look at something like that. Just to continue very briefly, of course, in the next generation, we have two of the great artists of the 19th century, both of whom used watercolour extensively throughout their careers. John Constable, a very simple little study of the coastline off the English coast, almost certainly painted from a boat. I don't see how you could have got that view if you hadn't been out in the sea or on the sea to do it. But really what this is about observing the atmosphere, looking at the landscape in terms of the experience of being in it, of looking at the precise weather conditions under which it's painted, the way that the light in the sky determines the extent of the visibility, of your ability to see, the way in which the weather can interpose itself as a kind of filter of human experience as you look at the landscape. And of course, when we look at Tony's work, his trip to the Maldives, which was made essentially so that he could do those underwater paintings, nonetheless, he couldn't resist when he got up in the morning or went to bed, before he went to bed at night, observing exactly that same kind of meteorological condition in the landscape itself. The play of light, the sweeping of the clouds, the way in which, particularly in seascapes or anywhere near to vast expanses of water, there is a tendency for the light and the heat to dissolve the moisture into mists and to create these shimmering effects, which are some of the most transient and temporary effects of the landscape, in which the naked eye can only experience very, very momentarily before it all changes. But the ability of the artist to capture them and fix them and convey them to us is one of the reasons why I'm not ashamed to be an armchair traveler, to have these experiences brought to me so beautifully and so effectively. And again, look at the way he's used the texture of the paper, pulling that watercolor brush across the rough surface of the Whatman paper or whatever it is, leaving those brilliant highlights, which are nothing more than the bare paper underneath the pigment. Yes, and Turner, obviously another great master of atmosphere in the landscape. This watercolor has a name. It's called Crichton Castle, but it takes you quite a while to work out where the castle is, because it's not about Crichton Castle. It's not a topographical, architectural landscape drawing or watercolor. It's a view through the hills, through the mountains, in a rainstorm, complete with rainbow, and with once again that misty light dissolving and mystifying the details of the landscape in front of your eyes. Tony in the Maldives again, once again, another of those watercolors in which there is a kind of Turnerian quality, I think, here to that brilliant lighting, to the way in which the sky is reflected in the water, the very colors, and of course responding to the local climate conditions in terms of light values. He's much closer to the equator here. The light is stronger. There is that sense of almost of a kind of searing of the eyeballs. And one of the things you notice if you walk around the exhibition or any exhibition of Tony's work, wherever you are, he is faithful not just to the meteorological conditions of the day, but to the value of the light in the part of the world in which he's painting. As the 19th century wore on, that English watercolor tradition continued to develop, of course. Constable's naturalism was a prelude to a more scientific interest and approach to the landscape in the mid to late 19th century. This is a watercolor by John Brett, a painter associated with the Pre-Raphaelites, whose emphasis on precision and detail reflected the increased interest in natural phenomena, in geology in the mid-19th century, an interest that was in many ways encouraged and stimulated by the great Victorian sage and critic John Ruskin, writing to young artists in his preface to Modern Painters in 1843, "Go to nature in all singleness of heart, walk with her laboriously and trustingly, having no other thought but how best to penetrate her meaning, rejecting nothing, selecting nothing, and scorning nothing." An eye for detail, an eye for precision. And I think you can see why I'm making that point and why I'm relating it once again to the work of the artist that we're talking about and that I admire so much. Of course, here in this country, as Jim Ballinger pointed out in his wonderful talk, there is a point of comparison with Thomas Moran and with those American artist explorers of the 1870s who went often with exploration, journeys of exploration. Moran with Hayden's expedition to Yellowstone in 1871, and again a year or so later with Powell to the Grand Canyon. Moran, who became one of the great artist advocates of wide open spaces and landscapes in the 19th century, and whose work, as Jim pointed out, was a very important element in the campaign to establish national parks before the end of the 19th century. But there is a big difference too, and I don't think Jim would dispute this. Moran, in the end, was an idealist when it came to landscape painting. He actually wrote about his own work, and I quote, "My general scope is not realistic. All my tendencies are towards idealization. I did not wish to realize the scene literally, but to preserve and convey its true impression." That is very different from the way in which Tony records the landscapes as he sees them, and the way in which he, yes, commands the wide vista, has an undoubted sense of composition. He chooses the point from which he paints with the most meticulous eye for observation. There's nothing random about the point that he places himself. Having placed himself, though, that becomes the focal point for the whole composition. And once again, you see him authenticating his journey with the sketches of the local flora and fauna. In this case, on the trail, we have an outline here of the kind that you saw from the album earlier, of the actual ranges of the Sierra through which he's walking. You have the maps, because in this case, he's following a specific trail. Having moved from Thoreau and Walden, he's moved on to John Muir and Muir's promotion of the High Sierra in the 1860s and 1870s. Muir, like Moran, was a campaigner for the wild open spaces of nature. In every walk with nature, one receives more than one seeks, is one of his famous sayings, along with the mountains calling and I must go. The clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness. And it was John Muir's call to his fellow countrymen to climb the mountains and get their good tidings. He's a kind of evangelist for the outdoors in the 1860s, and another person who had a profound influence on the preservation movement of the late 19th century and the setting up of the national parks. Muir, I'm proud to say, a Scotsman by birth, but lived entirely in this country and, of course, was based here in California and set out on that trail through the High Sierra in 1868. And it was 116 years later, in 1986, that Tony recorded 225 miles hiking in the High Sierra, California, in the footsteps of John Muir. In the course of that journey, where conditions, again, along the High Sierra clearly change a great deal as you move from one area to another, once again, look how faithful he is to the precise and local conditions. This is actually done a little bit earlier, but you can see we're in a very different context, different color values, a different range of temperatures as well as light values in the landscape that he's painting. And once again, he's giving you all of the indicators of the journey that he's making, including the little packets, which I hesitate to call souvenirs because they're more than that. They are they are the kind of residue of the journey. They are the authentication of his traveling through the landscape as he collects them, and as he collects not just random stones, but shaped stones, arrowheads, and incorporates them either actually and physically into the work or draws them in great and meticulous detail. And there is the young Foster, I think on that expedition actually. He's in Yosemite working away in the landscape, not again as a kind of romantic idealist in the Moran mold or tradition, but very much as the rather unassuming English artist with his box of paints and his drawing board. So onward. And as you can see, in 1988, on the 3rd of May, the postmark is the 3rd of May, he wrote it on the 30th of April. We've been threading our way through the canyon for 4 weeks. We've been fried by the heat, frozen in the snow, but I've emerged with some good paintings. Hope to see you when I come to New York in 10 days, ? It was a direct result of his Sierra adventures and of the traveling companions, who were such an important part of where he went and what he did, that he was persuaded, initially rather reluctantly, and Jane can tell you about Bill Brace and Bill's efforts to get Tony to the rim of the canyon, an effort which was to be repaid 1,000 times over. I bet there are 1,000 sketches, drawings, watercolors, and studies, because the canyon has become a major element, a major motif for Tony, a major challenge, once again. Don't forget what I said earlier about a man who rises to the challenge but extends it in all ways possible. And let's have that without the postcard. There is one of these, and there are more here, one of these wonderful views, and when Jim spoke, he was very proud of this, because this is, of course, the watercolor which he acquired for the museum in Phoenix. I've always been astonished at the way in which the meticulous eye for detail, which is a hallmark of Tony's work, can nonetheless represent, not just represent, but represent and capture landscapes on this scale. The canyon, 13 miles across, a mile deep, with all of those geological strata. This is the history of the world exposed in stones, but recorded in every detail. And I think Jim got a long way in his talk to explaining why. Because this isn't a photograph, it's not an objective record by a passive instrument. Apologies to great photographers, but there are such things, of course. But there's so many artists who have attempted the canyon without much success, with disastrous results, because they are simply unable to convey that impression of extent and depth. And Tony, an artist whose style some people would describe as miniaturist, has managed to be magnificent and to magnify the impression, the impact of the canyon itself. And it isn't just the aspen leaves going from summer to fall as a kind of running commentary. It certainly isn't the sand and soils that he's collected and put into a tube along the baseline there. It's the way in which cumulatively all of this speaks of his experience. He is there, and he takes us there with him, And it's impossible not to use the present tense when talking about the extraordinary way that he conveys that sense of the canyon, the way that when you visit the canyon, as I've been privileged to do, sadly not with Tony, and not getting any further than the rim, I have to say, but to experience it is a life-changing experience. And to have an artist capable of bringing that back to you and of reminding you of the awe-inspiring nature of the canyon is, I think, an extraordinary achievement, but it's also testimony to there's something amazing and magical about this man and his work. Well, just to return to my friendship with Tony, in 1995, Lisa and I moved back to England, as you heard from Jane, and I suppose from then onwards we saw a little bit more of one another because we were both based in the same country. He was continuing his journeys, his travels, and at the same time we would meet up for delightful occasions together as our friendship was not just renewed but reinvigorated. And I was very honored actually in the late 90s when Tony asked me to help him prepare what was going to be the first major retrospective of his work to date, to almost the end of the 20th century, in this exhibition of Worldviews, Watercolor Diaries of Tony Foster, which was projected for the Fry Art Gallery in Seattle to open in 2000. It was a tremendous privilege, obviously, to have shown Tony share with me the contents of his studio, to help him sift through and sort through this amazing body of work that he'd assembled to that date with an idea of putting together a representative display. And I have to say, and be perfectly honest, a lot of this was for the social pleasure as well as the professional satisfaction. His correspondence, I think, says most of it. On the 20th of June in 2000, I get a note from Tony thanking me for the great lunch last week. It cheered me up enormously. And then he adds, a solo career can sometimes seem like being eternally damned to push a rock uphill. So your support of my work and friendship, just the boost I needed. I left the restaurant with renewed determination, and I'm sure it wasn't just caused by the wine. And then a short time later, in another letter, I suppose it must have been the wine made me spill the beans about my early life. I normally like to keep the murky details quiet, so I'd be grateful if you could treat it in confidence. He needn't have worried, because I had no recollection at all after that particular evening. There we are. So at the same time, I was, Tony would, that was his, I couldn't resist including this, that was his thank you letter, in a way. Inscribed, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Thanks, Duncan. I'm not sure the opposite is true, actually, but I think I got the better deal in this particular bargain. But a wonderful small work by Tony. This is a 10-inch by 10-inch, or maybe a 12-inch frame around a delightful little work, which I was very, very honored to get as a gift from the artist. And as you can see, I not only tracked his exhibitions from this point, but I sort of got dragged along as the person who would say a few apposite words on one occasion or another. This is Watermarks at Exeter, and there is you-know-who holding forth to the assembled company. And once again, searching for a bigger subject at the Royal Watercolour Society in 2000 and, I'm searching now, 6, I think, 5, 6, something like that. Now, the canyon, yes, and we all know that the canyon has become one of Tony's major preoccupations. It's almost as though whatever project he launches, whether it's sacred places or beauty or traveling out west, whatever, somehow there's an excuse to return to the challenge of that extraordinary space. But of course, he'd also taken on another big challenge by then, which was Everest, the mountain that he said, in retrospect, I thought I knew about mountains until I went to paint Everest. Why should it be different? Just more extreme, surely. Well, as we know, again from the diaries and the paintings, Everest was perhaps physically to be one of the greatest of the challenges which Tony faced as a painter. The bigger subject for the catalogue of the exhibition, he manages a smile, but it wasn't all smiles by any means on that Everest expedition. Up at 6:30 to get a look at Everest in the early morning light. The paint keeps freezing on my brush, and when I mix gin in with it, it sinks into the paper and then freezes. We try hot water, but that freezes too. By the time I've done these 3 experiments, I've messed up Everest. Cold wind is blowing and I can see disaster staring me in the face. Work until 4:45 when I can stand it no longer. Back in the tent by 5, still shivering uncontrollably as I write this, 7:15. The next day is even worse. Wake up feeling like crap. I'm exhausted just getting up and dressing, so rather than adjusting to altitude, I seem to be getting worse. I noticed that I'm coughing up blood as well as being very swollen up all over. I can hardly force my boots on and have had a cracking headache for 5 days. I think my body might be telling me something. Decide down to go to Gokyo. First, I insist on finishing the drawing and making notes on the painting. Unbearable for it to be a total waste. We'll try to do something to it when I get back to the studio. Hours later, in sight of a porter's rescue clinic, Dr. John and the Sherpa assistant check me over. I have a medium to severe case of acute mountain sickness, pulmonary edema, and cerebral edema. He gives me cortisone and oxygen, and I'm zipped into a gammo bag, which was then inflated with a foot pump to increase the pressure and make it seem like 9,000 feet. The assistant pumped for an hour to keep the air flowing. Truth to tell, it was pretty nice in there, warm, pleasant, secure. But of course, as a result, he captured these extraordinary images, 17,800 feet at his highest. And I think Jane and I were talking about this. I don't think we're going to challenge him when he says that he's the artist who's painted Everest from the highest elevation. But notice it's again capturing the image, and who doesn't shiver when they look at things like this? But notice again what's included in the frame, the commentary, which in this case is not textual, it's visual, but it's imagery. These are the icons which substantiate not just the journey, but the effect that it has on the artist as he travels to these remote parts of the world where he doesn't only look at the landscape and appreciate it from that tradition of, 2 traditions really, that tradition I've stressed of the great watercolor tradition of traveling artists, of artist explorers, but also the tradition of the environmentalists, of the people who want to protect what is left of raw nature, want to protect the wildernesses of the world, and want to respect the cultures which lie under them, whether it's the arrowheads from the depths of the canyon, from the floor of the canyon, or these often gifts which are made to Tony by the people that he encounters. As he says, the work is not just about landscape painting, it also requires a narrative to link it to the means of its making, a connection to place and time encounters and personalities. And what a marvelous store of narrative is supplied by treks in the Himalayas. To spend time with my Sherpa friends and to try to learn about their culture and Buddhist philosophy is to become enriched. They committed themselves absolutely to the project and were as despondent as I when it failed, or equally delighted when it was successful. The souvenirs which accompany the Everest series, the silk katas, religious artifacts, bits of prayer flags, are symbolic of the all-pervading benign influence of their philosophy and religion on the enterprise, the influence of that on the enterprise. Tony, in other words, is not just a passive observer. He's someone who immerses himself deeply into the underlying culture of the landscapes that he explores as an artist now in the 21st century, and in doing so appreciates and reflects the history of those landscapes, the human history, as well as the actual geological facts and the nature of the landscape itself. So, breathless at 17,800 feet, still utterly dependent on, in this case, the Sherpas who accompanied his journey, but an artist who is relentless in pursuing his own mission, a mission which I've tried to suggest is a dual mission as an artist and as someone who is deeply respectful and extremely anxious to expose the cultures which belong to these landscapes. And there is, of course, quite a moving footnote to this particular image of Everest. And I have to confess, it was only today that I discovered it belongs to Jane. I'm absolutely delighted it does, because it couldn't be in better hands. In 2015, Tony was about to embark on another expedition into the Himalayas, in this case, an expedition to Tibet, 2 days before the devastating earthquake of 2015, which killed 9,000 people, which the estimate of the damage after that earthquake was, I believe, something like $9 billion, which doesn't sound very much by our standards, but it did amount to half the gross domestic product of the country for that particular year. So what did Tony do? He felt deeply about the people who'd become his friends and who were now suffering the direct consequences of that natural disaster. With Jane's permission, he created a 200 edition impression, a print of 200 impressions of a print of that same landscape. Here you can see the copy I subscribed to is number 70 out of 200, in order to raise money for the relief of the Tibetans. He, through the sale of the prints and through various other charitable undertakings, including sort of raffles in the local pub and the kinds of things that only Tony can pull off in his inimitable way. He is, as those of you who know him will confirm, one of the most persuasive people you could possibly meet. In the course of a couple of months, he'd raised close to £10,000 as his contribution to emergency relief for this part of the world. Needless to add, none of the costs involved in producing the print were subtracted from the proceeds from the sale of the prints, and it was a sign both of his commitment and of his generosity, I think, that he undertook that particular project. Again, I can't resist showing this because this was the keepsake that he distributed to his friends to celebrate his own 60th birthday. Heavens above, it's more than 10 years ago. Makes both of us feel rather old. Once again, it's the thought that counts, but it's the thoughtfulness of the images themselves. Beautiful little watercolor studies, White Mountain, bristle pine, Costa Rica rainforest feather, Grand Canyon rock, and Joshua Tree desert seed. What do they represent? They represent his aspirations, but also his principles as an artist. His aspiration, longevity, his principles and aspiration, freedom, stability, vitality. From one 60-year-old to all of his friends, wishing you all of these. And there it is. There were 50 lucky recipients of this life-enhancing little gift. Well, beauty was not just one journey, but a whole series of journeys, and it's here. So I'm not going to go into works in any detail, but just to remind you that once again, it was a fearless exploration, in this case, not just of specific places, but of a concept, an idea which, if you like, had suffered, rather, at the hands of 20th century philosophers and aestheticians. We're a million miles away from the confidence of a 19th century romantic poet who could write that beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that is all you know and need to know, because the existence of beauty in the 20th century was not only questioned but denied by a whole school or several schools of philosophers until the end of the 20th century, when, funnily enough, the tables began to turn somewhat, and even philosophers began to realize there was such a thing. Something that artists, of course, knew already and never abandoned. In Tony's case, what did he do? Again, this is collaboration. This time he didn't choose the sites. He asked a whole range of people, from directors of natural history museums, geologists, archaeologists, distinguished people, conservation people, environmental people, people like Bill Brace, people like Annie and Bill Vanderbilt, who'd been with him on some of his most arduous and challenging expeditions. He asked them to nominate the places he could visit, and needless to say, the canyon was high on the list. Back at the canyon, 2013. Once again, the canyon in all of its challenges, and some of the challenges, of course, are to do with not just the difficulty, but the fact that in some of the places where Tony's worked, he hasn't been in solitary isolation. He's often been, started at Walden Pond, when I think he found himself suddenly surrounded by tourists who began to take photographs of what he was painting, because, as he said, he'd obviously authenticated that particular view and they all wanted to capture it. But here he was, up at 5:15 and hoping to get on site before the tourists turn up, because I don't want to keep giving endless explanations of what I'm up to, especially as I haven't assembled the gigantic new drawing board, 7 feet by 4, and have horrible visions of not being physically able to erect it on the edge of the canyon or see over the top of it. I arrive at the trailhead at 7 and haul the equipment out in 2 trips, scoping out the possible sites. I was going to set up under a tree, but decided that dappled shade on my paper is very difficult, so opted for an open site right on the edge of the drop-off. The setup took 2 hours of collecting rocks, down trees to use as props, and lashing the entire rig together. Even so, he looks pretty pleased with himself, I have to say. But once again, that care with which he chooses the site, decides where to go, as well as what to paint. So, beauty. And as I say, I'm not going to go into beauty in any detail, because here it is. From the extraordinary caves, the Mulu caves in Borneo, to Taiwadreth on his own doorstep. And ironically, in a way, according to Tony, as he wrote at one point, many artists think of Cornwall as a destination. Here is the Cornish resident for whom everywhere else is a destination. Its beautiful landscape, benign climate, and relaxed ambience are all conducive to the making of art. It's ironic that I travel from here deliberately seeking places where few people, and even fewer artists, have ever set foot in order to make my work. Strangely enough, I find it harder to make work about Cornwall than anywhere else. Well, if that's anything to go by, he overcame the hardship. So here we are in his studio at Tywardreath in September of 2017. That's Lisa, my wife, with Tony, looking at that wonderful suite of 6, as you can see, relatively small watercolor studies painted in the canyon earlier that year. Heraclitus 3, specifically created as a journey, as a serialized journey through the canyon to become a gift to the Yale Center for British Art given through the Foster Foundation. So there they are, before they're all framed up, but already identified with the additions, with those signs or symbols or icons of authentication, as Tony, in his imitable way, points out the detail to Lisa standing in the studio. And there he is again. And I make no apology for the second shot of the studio because it includes that wonderful board, and there's a photograph of it over there somewhere, that board to which he's clipped all those little packets that haven't yet found their way into the margins of the works that he's created. And right in the top left-hand corner, his cabinet of curiosities. Again, that collection of gifts, artifacts, natural objects, things that he's either picked up or been given along the way on his journey. Well, I made a joke of the fact that I'd never traveled anywhere with Tony except to Cornwall, but I have to say we've had some pretty good times in Cornwall, in the Fowey Peninsula, around the villages in and around St. Lossiel. I think when we took this, we were probably sitting in the garden of the pub across the road in St. Winnowes, looking at the English countryside as only the English countryside can be, with its flowered edges, with its crumbling stone and old stables, even the cows grazing in the field beyond. This is perhaps included as a kind of apology for my lack of wanderlust, but here we are. And finally, here they are. I showed you the two of them outside the centre in 1985. Here they are in 2017, where on their own doorstep in Well Street, Tywardreath, looking very cheerfully at their departing guests and waving goodbye. But I don't want to end on a frivolous note. I just want to end by reminding you that there is a fundamental earnestness and seriousness about Tony's work, in spite of the way that he wears it lightly. As he says, all my work is based on the philosophy that our planet is a glorious, beautiful, but fragile place, but a place we cannot continue to use as if ours is the only generation that needs it. And there is that fundamental message running right through the work, and I believe it is one of the serious motivations of Tony's wilderness journeys, that while he derives a great deal from the great tradition to which he is now a great contributor of English landscape painting, at the same time there is that other tradition going back to the mid-19th century to preserve the wilderness, whether it's on the part of Thoreau in New England, Muir in the High Sierra. And I think it's one of the reasons why Tony's work resonates as widely as it does. He is appreciated well beyond the artistic community by people who share some of those values, but also have the expert knowledge which he has obtained in terms of not just observation, but the scientific knowledge of the landscape and its vulnerability and its susceptibility. And once again, I think that is one of the reasons why the Foster is so important for all of us and for Tony. And I'm going to end by saying, please, please encourage all your friends to come here. Don't just come again often yourselves, but just remind people that now in particular, at a time when we cannot take preservation for granted, it's particularly important to come and not just see the work and appreciate the work, but understand the message of this work, which Jane is helping to not just preserve, but promote. And remember, yes, his work is all about journeys, but the destination is not the end of the trail. The destination is this. It's the work which results from those journeys. And this is another reason why I'm not going to apologize for being the Armchair Traveler, because we are the direct beneficiaries of not only Tony's observations, not only his own experience, but the fact that he manages to encapsulate that, to convey it, and to, out of those fleeting moments, Jane quoted Heraclitus, no one steps into the same stream twice, but what Tony does is to distill that experience day by day and to capture those fleeting moments and convert them into works of art, into, if you like, the permanence, the indelible permanence of the work of art. And that, I think, finally, is the message I'd like to leave you with. And apart from thanking you, apologize for overrunning so desperately on the time allotted to me. Thank you very much.